The strait is closed. 2,000 ships are sitting anchored in the Persian Gulf right now, waiting, not because they are being attacked, because nobody knows when it will be safe to try. America launched an operation to reopen it. It failed. Iran is still loading 1.5 million barrels of oil every single day, and almost all of it is getting through. Not through the strait, through a corridor America cannot touch, cannot sanction, and cannot see. 3 parties. 3 completely different weapons. And the one holding the key to ending this crisis is the one that has said almost nothing publicly. If you want to understand what is actually happening before it hits the headlines, subscribe right now. Now let us get into it. The weapon that changed everything, and why it worked. For decades, military planners in Washington had a quiet assumption about the Strait of Hormuz. Iran could threaten to close it. Iran could posture about closing it. But actually closing it, sustaining that closure against American naval power, was considered beyond Tehran's real capability. That assumption was tested on February 28, 2026. And it broke. Here is what Iran actually did. And here is why it worked when everyone assumed it would not. Iran did not try to match American naval power. It did not send warships into direct confrontation with U.S. carrier groups. It did something far more effective. It made the strait dangerous. Drones, naval mines, swarming small boats that appear without warning and disappear just as fast. None of these individually can stop the U.S. Navy. Together, they create something the U.S. Navy cannot easily solve: uncertainty. Ship captains do not need to be sunk to stop sailing. They need to believe the risk is too high. Pre-war, 120 vessels crossed Hormuz daily. Within weeks of Iran's closure, that number collapsed to 5 or 6 per day. Not because the U.S. Navy was defeated. Because shipping companies looked at the risk calculation and decided the math did not work. Insurance rates for Gulf shipping spiked over 600%. That single number tells you everything. The market priced in what the military could not prevent. America's response was Project Freedom, a naval escort operation announced with considerable fanfare to protect vessels transiting the strait. Jennifer Kavanagh of Defense Priorities, one of America's most respected defense analysts, assessed it plainly. It does not address the underlying problem. The uncertainty that stops ship captains from sailing does not disappear because a U.S. warship is nearby. It just becomes a different kind of uncertainty. And here is the asymmetry that makes Iran's position genuinely difficult for Washington to solve. For Iran, the strait is existential. Keeping it closed is the only remaining leverage a country has after its leadership has been killed and its infrastructure bombed. For America, the strait is a political problem. Gas prices are high. Approval ratings are falling. The president needs a win before the next news cycle. That gap in stakes, existential versus political, is precisely why Iranian leaders believe they can outlast American pressure. Not because they are stronger, because they have no choice but to endure. The hidden equation, what the coverage keeps missing. Here is the part that almost no coverage bothers to mention. And once you understand it, the entire crisis looks completely different. The conflict has settled into what the Center for Strategic and International Studies calls a paradoxical equilibrium. Iran is blocking Hormuz. America is blockading Iranian ports. Both sides are hurting each other. Neither side can force the other to stop without costs that neither side is currently willing to pay. Iran's economy was already in serious trouble before the war. American strikes destroyed infrastructure. The U.S. naval blockade is preventing imports. Inflation is squeezing Iranian households, food prices, fuel costs, basic goods, all rising sharply. Iran is being hurt. That part of the American strategy is working. But here is the number that destroys the logic of the entire pressure campaign. Iran is still loading approximately 1.5 million barrels of oil every single day. China is receiving 1.25 million of those barrels daily. Think about what that actually means. America has bombed Iran's military infrastructure. America has blockaded Iran's ports. America has pressured every major financial institution in the world to cut ties with Tehran. And yet, Iran's primary revenue stream, crude oil, is flowing almost uninterrupted to its largest customer. Not through the Strait, not through any route America can monitor or disrupt. Through a railway corridor and overland routes that operate entirely outside Western-controlled shipping lanes and entirely outside the dollar payment system. China has been settling Iranian oil in yuan since 2012. No SWIFT transactions, no American bank involvement, no leverage point for Washington to squeeze. The Special Eurasia Geopolitical Consulting Agency assessed the China-Iran railway directly. It helps mitigate the risks of naval interdiction by Western forces. That is not a future capability. It is operating right now. Iran is being economically pressured and militarily degraded. And it is still getting paid. That combination, ongoing revenue plus existential motivation, is precisely why Washington's pressure campaign has not produced the outcome it expected. The strait is still closed, the oil is still flowing, and the country holding the actual off-ramp has not been seriously engaged. Right now, approximately 2,000 ships are stranded in the Persian Gulf, waiting, anchored, unable to move. Not because they are being attacked, because nobody knows when it will be safe enough to try. China's three-layer position and why it is the most powerful in the room. China has said very little publicly about the Hormuz crisis. That silence is not neutrality. It is leverage. To understand why China's position is so powerful, you need to understand three things it holds simultaneously that no other actor in this crisis possesses. The first is economic dependency. China buys roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. Iran's economy, already sanctioned, already bombed, already blockaded, runs on Chinese demand. If Beijing decided tomorrow to stop purchasing Iranian oil, Tehran's last functioning revenue stream would collapse within weeks. Iran knows this, which means Beijing has more real influence over Iranian decision-making than any American aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. The second is the 2021 strategic partnership. China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership in 2021, committing $400 billion in Chinese investment across Iranian infrastructure, technology, and energy sectors. That agreement did not just bind Iran to China economically. It gave Beijing a permanent seat at any table where Iran's future is being decided. Washington spent decades building the architecture of Iranian isolation. China signed one document and stepped inside it. The third is the railway. The China-Iran freight corridor operates entirely outside Western-controlled shipping lanes, entirely outside the dollar payment system, entirely outside any choke point the U.S. Navy can threaten. When America blockades Iranian ports, the railway keeps moving. When insurance rates make Gulf shipping impossible, the railway is unaffected. When SWIFT sanctions cut Iranian banks off from global finance, yuan settlements on the railway continue. It is worth pausing here to really feel the weight of that. America spent decades building a pressure architecture around Iran based on controlling every financial and logistical choke point. China spent the same decades building a parallel system that bypasses every single one of those choke points simultaneously. The off-ramp from this crisis exists. China is holding it. The question Washington has not answered and has barely asked publicly is what it would cost to get Beijing to use it. Because asking China for help means acknowledging that China's parallel system works, that the railway matters, that yuan settlements are real, that the 25-year partnership has teeth. and that the architecture of Iranian isolation that Washington spent decades building has a door in it that Beijing controls. America has not been willing to say that out loud. The strait remains closed. What America is actually doing and what it cannot fix. Washington is not sitting still. And to be fair about what the pressure campaign has actually accomplished, Iran is hurting. American strikes degraded significant military infrastructure. The naval blockade is preventing imports that Iran desperately needs. Inflation inside Iran is severe. The Irjik is operating with degraded capability compared to pre-war levels. These are real effects. The problem is not that the pressure is not working. The problem is that it is not working fast enough to reopen the strait before the economic damage to America's allies becomes politically unsustainable. Southeast Asian nations almost entirely dependent on Gulf oil have issued warnings about economic collapse. Singapore, one of America's closest partners in the region, has repeatedly signaled the crisis is threatening its economy. Europe is scrambling for alternative energy supplies. Gulf producers that rely on Hormuz, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain cannot export the majority of their oil. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission flagged in its most recent assessment that China is actively positioning itself to maximize strategic advantage from this crisis across military, economic, and diplomatic dimensions simultaneously. The Economist magazine ran Xi Jinping's face on its cover with a Napoleon quote, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." That framing is not accidental. It captures exactly what Beijing is doing. America's allies are the ones feeling the pain of a closed strait. China opened a valve on its 1.2 billion barrel strategic petroleum reserve, assembled over years by purchasing sanctioned Iranian oil at below-market prices, and absorbed the initial shock. While Washington's allies scrambled, Beijing managed. The impossible choice is landing on the desk of energy ministers across 3 continents right now. Accept American leadership on Iran and watch your economy contract as the strait stays closed. Or quietly engage with the Chinese-managed alternative system that is keeping oil moving and accept the political alignment that comes with it. There is no neutral option. Washington understands what that means. It is paying very close attention. But attention has not reopened the strait. How this ends, 3 scenarios, and what each one means. Here is the honest picture of where this crisis goes. Nobody knows how it ends. But there are 3 realistic scenarios, and each one tells you something important about the world that comes after. Scenario 1. America succeeds. Project Freedom works well enough, the blockade squeezes Iran hard enough, and Tehran agrees to reopen the strait in exchange for some easing of pressure. This is Washington's stated goal. If it happens, America can claim the pressure campaign worked. But the railway still exists. The yuan payment system still works. China's strategic petroleum reserve is still assembled. The parallel system that China built does not disappear because one crisis ended. Scenario 2. China intervenes. Beijing uses its leverage over Tehran to broker a quiet understanding that gradually reopens commercial traffic. This is actually the most likely path to a real solution. But it comes at a price. America has to acknowledge that China's leverage is real, that the 2021 partnership matters, that the alternative financial and logistical architecture Beijing built is functional enough to serve as the actual off-ramp from a major geopolitical crisis. That acknowledgement has consequences that extend well beyond this strait. Scenario 3. The crisis drags. Neither side forces a resolution. The strait stays partially closed. Global energy markets adapt slowly and painfully. Alternative routes, pipelines, overland corridors, Arctic shipping absorb more volume over months and years. Iran's economy degrades further, but does not collapse because Chinese demand continues. America's allies suffer, but do not break because they find workarounds. This scenario is not a resolution. It is a new normal, and in that new normal, the infrastructure China built, the railway, the yuan settlements, the reserve, becomes permanently embedded in how global energy moves. The strait that was once described as the jugular of the world economy becomes one option among several. Less decisive, less controllable, less useful as a pressure point. That is the shift that no military operation can reverse. The US built aircraft carriers. China built corridors. And right now, the corridor is running while the carriers watch. If this video gave you a genuinely new way of looking at what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, not just the military standoff, but the three-sided leverage game underneath it, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what we cover next. Turn on notifications because this story is moving fast and you do not want to be the last to know. Now here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. Of the three scenarios, America forces Iran to back down, China brokers the solution, or the crisis just drags into a new normal, which one do you think actually happens? And what does your answer say about who really holds power in 2026? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think.